Sir Hugh takes his secret to the grave with a vicious grin on his lips, a devious grin that is contagious. F. Marion Crawford, today on the Classic Tales podcast. Welcome to the Classic Tales podcast. Thank you for listening. We are proudly supported by our listeners. Please sign up to be a supporter for as little as $5 a month. We'll give you a monthly coupon code for $8 off any audiobook order. Your support helps us make amazing audiobooks and other tools to help improve literacy. Go to classictalesaudiobooks.com and become a financial supporter today. Thank you so much. Bellarion the Fortunate by Raphael Sabatini is now released. Continue listening after today's story for a healthy sample of this amazing piece of historical fiction. Order now and be entered in a drawing to win a Treasure Island Audiobookmark gift set, just in time for the holidays. I heard something that didn't sit right with me last week. There's a book club in my neighborhood that wanted to discuss the Scarlet Letter, and a couple of the people in the group were excited, but waiting for the audiobook to be available at the local library. Well, we're not doing that. My friend Rachel came up with this idea, and I've embellished it. Here it is. If you're doing a classic title for your book club, you can buy one copy of the audiobook on my website and share the download link with the people in your book club for no extra charge. Just send me an email and let me know the plan. Furthermore, if you want, we can set up a Zoom call, and I can talk to your book club about the creation of the audiobook that you all are discussing. Again, just send me an email and we can set it up. I'm happy to do it. And finally, one more thing. Audiobookmarks, the bookmark with QR codes to stream an audiobook that I've developed, can be read by Chromebooks. So kids who are reading Huckleberry Finn, Great Expectations, etc., in many public schools can listen to my narration and follow along even if they don't have a smartphone. It struck me that the audiobookmarks can be a dynamic way to help kids learn to read, and it can help adults learn to read better. I'm starting a venture to get all of the most commonly studied titles into this audiobookmarks format and get them into the hands of students everywhere. If you want to be a part of this, simply make any purchase at our website at classictalesaudiobooks.com. This is our new direction and focus. Make amazing audiobooks and use them to create tools to help people of all ages learn to read better. Improving literacy is what we're all about. Thank you for helping us out. Okay, now it's time for a nice, scary story. Happy Halloween, everyone. So let's turn down the lights and listen to The Dead Smile by F. Marion Crawford. Chapter 1. Sir Hugh Ockram smiled as he sat by the open window of his study in the late August afternoon. And just then a curiously yellow cloud obscured the low sun, and the clear summer light turned lurid, as if it had been suddenly poisoned and polluted by the foul vapors of a plague. Sir Hugh's face seemed, at best, to be made of fine parchment, drawn skin-tight over a wooden mask, in which two eyes were sunk out of sight and peered from far within through crevices under the slanting, wrinkled lids, alive and watchful, like two toads in their holes, side by side and exactly alike. But as the light changed, then a little yellow glare flashed in each. Nurse MacDonald said once that when Sir Hugh smiled, he saw the faces of two women in hell. Two dead women he had betrayed. Nurse MacDonald was 100 years old. And the smile widened, stretching the pale lips across the discolored teeth in an expression of profound self-satisfaction. blended with the most unforgiving hatred and contempt for the human doll. The hideous disease of which he was dying had touched his brain. His son stood beside him, tall, white, and delicate as an angel in a primitive picture. And though there was deep distress in his violet eyes as he looked at his father's face, he felt the shadow of that sickening smile stealing across his own lips and parting them and drawing them against his will. And it was like a bad dream, for he tried not to smile and smiled the more. Beside him, strangely like him in her wan angelic beauty, with the same shadowy golden hair, the same sad violet eyes, the same luminously pale face, Evelyn Warburton rested one hand upon his arm. And as she looked into her uncle's eyes, and could not turn her own away, she knew that the deathly smile was hovering on her own red lips, drawing them tightly across her little teeth, while two bright tears ran down her cheeks to her mouth, and dropped from the upper to the lower lip while she smiled. And the smile was like the shadow of death and the seal of damnation upon her pure young face. "Of course," said Sir Hugh very slowly, and still looking out at the trees. "If you have made up your mind to be married, I cannot hinder you. And I don't suppose you attach the smallest importance to my consent." "Father!" exclaimed Gabriel reproachfully. "No, I do not deceive myself," continued the old man, smiling terribly. "You will marry when I am dead, though there is a very good reason why you had better not. Why you had better not," he repeated very emphatically, and he slowly turned his toad eyes upon the lovers. "What reason?" asked Evelyn in a frightened voice. "Never mind the reason, my dear. You will marry just as if it did not exist." There was a long pause. "Two gone," he said, his voice lowering strangely. "And two more will be four, all together, forever and ever, burning, burning, burning bright." At the last words his head sank slowly back, and the little glare of the toad eyes disappeared under the swollen lids, and the lurid cloud passed from the westering sun, so that the earth was green again, and the light pure. Sir Hugh had fallen asleep, as he often did in his last illness, even while speaking. Gabriel Ockram drew Evelyn away, and from the study they went out into the dim hall, softly closing the door behind them, and each audibly drew breath, as though some sudden danger had been passed. They laid their hands each in the other's, and their strangely like eyes met in a long look, in which love and perfect understanding were darkened by the secret terror of an unknown thing. Their pale faces reflected each other's fear. "It is his secret," said Evelyn at last. "He will never tell us what it is." "If he dies with it," answered Gabriel, "let it be on his own head." "On his head," echoed the dim hall. It was a strange echo, and some were frightened by it, for they said that if it were a real echo, it should repeat everything and not give back a phrase here and there, now speaking, now silent. But Nurse MacDonald said that the great hall would never echo a prayer when an Ockram was to die, though it would give back curses 10 for 1. "On his head," it repeated quite softly, and Evelyn started and looked round. "It is only the echo," said Gabriel, leading her away. They went out into the late afternoon light, and sat upon a stone seat behind the chapel, which was built across the end of the east wing. It was very still, not a breath stirred, and there was no sound near them. Only far off in the park, a songbird was whistling the high prelude to the evening chorus. "It is very lonely here," said Evelyn, taking Gabriel's hand nervously and speaking as if she dreaded to disturb the silence. "If it were dark, I should be afraid." "Of what? Of me?" Gabriel's sad eyes turned to her. "Oh, no. How could I be afraid of you? But of the old Ockrams. They say they are just under our feet here in the north vault, outside the chapel, all in their shrouds, with no coffins, as they used to bury them. As they always will. As they will bury my father, and me. They say an Ockram will not lie in a coffin." "But it cannot be true. These are fairy tales, ghost stories." Evelyn nestled nearer to her companion, grasping his hand more tightly, and the sun began to go down. "Of course. But there is the story of old Sir Vernon, who was beheaded for treason under James II. The family brought his body back from the scaffold in an iron coffin with heavy locks, and they put it in the north vault. But ever afterwards, whenever the vault was opened to bury another of the family, they found the coffin wide open, and the body standing upright against the wall, and the head rolled away in a corner, smiling at it." "As Uncle Hugh smiles?" Evelyn shivered. "Yes, I suppose so," answered Gabriel thoughtfully. "Of course I never saw it, and the vault has not been opened for 30 years. None of us has died since then." "And if Uncle Hugh dies, shall you—" Evelyn stopped, and her beautiful thin face was quite white. "Yes, I shall see him laid there too, with his secret, whatever it is." Gabriel sighed and pressed the girl's little hand. "I do not like to think of it," she said unsteadily. "Oh, Gabriel, what can the secret be? He said we had better not marry. Not that he forbade it, but he said it so strangely, and he smiled. Ugh!" Her small white teeth chattered with fear, and she looked over her shoulder while drawing still closer to Gabriel. "And somehow I felt it in my own face." "So did I," answered Gabriel in a low, nervous voice. "Nurse MacDonald—" He stopped abruptly. What did she say?" "Oh, nothing. She has told me things. They would frighten you, dear. Come, it is growing chilly." He rose, but Evelyn held his hand in both of hers, still sitting and looking up into his face. "But we shall be married just the same, Gabriel. Say that we shall." "Of course, darling, of course. But while my father is so very ill, it is impossible." "Oh, Gabriel, Gabriel, dear, I wish we were married now," cried Evelyn in sudden distress. "I know that something will prevent it and keep us apart." "Nothing shall." "Nothing?" "Nothing human," said Gabriel Ockram, as she drew him down to her. And their faces, that were so strangely alike, met and touched, and Gabriel knew that the kiss had a marvelous savor of evil, but on Evelyn's lips it was like the cool breath of a sweet and mortal fear. And neither of them understood, for they were innocent and young. Yet she drew him to her by her lightest touch, as a sensitive plant shivers and waves its thin leaves, and bends and closes softly upon what it wants. And he let himself be drawn to her willingly, as he would if her touch had been deadly and poisonous, for she strangely loved that half-voluptuous breath of fear, and he passionately desired the nameless evil something that lurked in her maiden lips. "It is as if we loved in a strange dream," she said. "I fear the waking," he murmured. "We shall not wake, dear. When the dream is over, it will have already turned into death, so softly that we shall not know it. But until then—" She paused, and her eyes sought his, and their faces slowly came nearer. It was as if they had thoughts in their red lips that foresaw and foreknew the deep kiss of each other. "Until then," she said again, very low, and her mouth was nearer to his. "Dream till then," murmured his breath. Chapter 2. Nurse MacDonald was 100 years old. She used to sleep, sitting all bent together in a grey old leathern armchair with wings, her feet in a bag footstool lined with sheepskin, and many warm blankets wrapped around her, even in summer. Beside her, a little lamp always burned at night by an old silver cup in which there was something to drink. Her face was very wrinkled, but the wrinkles were so small and fine and near together that they made shadows instead of lines. 2 thin locks of hair, that was turning from white to a smoky yellow again, were drawn over her temples from under her starched white cap. Every now and then she woke, and her eyelids were drawn up in tiny folds like little pink silk curtains, and her queer blue eyes looked straight before her through doors and walls and worlds to a far place beyond. Then she slept again, and her hands lay one upon the other on the edge of the blanket. The thumbs had grown longer than the fingers with age, and the joints shone in the low lamplight like polished crab apples. It was nearly 1 o'clock in the night, and the summer breeze was blowing the ivy branch against the panes of the window with a hushing caress. In the small room beyond, with the door ajar, the girl-maid who took care of Nurse MacDonald was fast asleep. All was very quiet. The old woman breathed regularly, and her indrawn lips trembled each time as the breath went out, and her eyes were shut. But outside the closed window, there was a face, and violet eyes were looking steadily at the ancient sleeper. For it was like the face of Evelyn Warburton, though there were 80 feet from the sill of the window to the foot of the tower. Yet the cheeks were thinner than Evelyn's, and as white as a gleam, and the eyes stared, and the lips were not red with life. They were dead, and painted with new blood. Slowly Nurse MacDonald's wrinkled eyelids folded themselves back, and she looked straight at the face at the window while one might count 10. "Is it time?" she asked, in her little old faraway voice. While she looked, the face at the window changed, for the eyes opened wider and wider, till the white glared all round the bright violet, and the bloody lips opened over gleaming teeth, and stretched and widened and stretched again, and the shadowy golden hair rose and streamed against the window in the night breeze. And in answer to Nurse MacDonald's question came the sound that freezes the living flesh. That low moaning voice that rises suddenly, like the scream of storm, from a moan to a wail, from a wail to a howl, from a howl to the fierce shriek of the tortured dead. He who has heard knows, and he can bear witness that the cry of the banshee is an evil cry to hear alone in the deep night. When it was over, and the face was gone, Nurse MacDonald shook a little in her great chair, and still she looked at the black square of the window. But there was nothing more there, nothing but the night and the whispering ivy branch. She turned her head to the door that was ajar, and there stood the girl in her white gown, her teeth chattering with fright. "It is time, child," said Nurse MacDonald. "I must go to him, for it is the end." She rose slowly, leaning her withered hands upon the arms of the chair, and the girl brought her a woolen gown and a great mantle, and her crutch-stick, and made her ready. But very often the girl looked at the window and was unjointed with fear, and often Nurse MacDonald shook her head and said words which the maid could not understand.
"It was like the face of Miss Evelyn,"
said the girl at last, trembling. But the ancient woman looked up sharply and angrily, and her queer blue eyes glared. She held herself by the arm of the great chair with her left hand, and lifted up her crutch-stick to strike the maid with all her might. But she did not.
"You are a good girl," she said, "but you're a fool. Pray for wit, child, pray for wit, or else find service in another house than Ockram Hall. Bring the lamp, and help me under my left arm."
The crutch-stick clacked on the wooden floor, and the low heels of the woman's slippers clappered after her in slow triplets, as Nurse MacDonald got toward the door. And down the stairs each step she took was a labor in itself, and by the clacking noise the waking servants knew that she was coming, very long before they saw her. No one was sleeping now, and there were lights and whisperings and pale faces in the corridors near Sir Hugh's bedroom. And now someone went in, and now someone came out, but everyone made way for Nurse MacDonald, who had nursed Sir Hugh's father more than 80 years ago. The light was soft and clear in the room. There stood Gabriel Ockram by his father's bedside, and there knelt Evelyn Warburton, her hair lying like a golden shadow down her shoulders, and her hands clasped nervously together. And opposite Gabriel, a nurse was trying to make Sir Hugh drink, but he would not. And though his lips were parted, his teeth were set. He was very, very thin and yellow now, and his eyes caught the light sideways, and were as yellow coals.
"Do not torment him,"
said Nurse MacDonald to the woman who held the cup.
"Let me speak to him, for his hour is come."
"Let us speak to him," said Gabriel in a dull voice. So the ancient woman leaned to the pillow and laid the feather-weight of her withered hand, that was like a brown moth, upon Sir Hugh's yellow fingers, and she spoke to him earnestly, while only Gabriel and Evelyn were left in the room to hear.
"Hugh Ockram," she said, "this is the end of your life, and as I saw you born, and saw your father born before you, I am come to see you die. Hugh Ockram, will you tell me the truth?"
The dying man recognized the little faraway voice he had known all his life, and he very slowly turned his yellow face to Nurse MacDonald, but he said nothing. Then she spoke again.
"Hugh Ockram, you will never see the daylight again. Will you tell the truth?"
His toad-like eyes were not yet dull. They fastened themselves on her face.
"What do you want of me?"
he asked, and each word struck hollow upon the last.
"I have no secrets. I have lived a good life."
Nurse MacDonald laughed, a tiny cracked laugh that made her old head bob and tremble a little, as if her neck were on a steel spring. But Sir Hugh's eyes grew red, and his pale lips began to twist.
"Let me die in peace,"
he said slowly. But Nurse MacDonald shook her head, and her brown, moth-like hand left his and fluttered to his forehead.
"By the mother that bore you and died of grief for the sins you did, tell me the truth!"
Sir Hugh's lips tightened on his discolored teeth.
"Not on earth,"
he answered slowly.
"By the wife who bore your son and died heartbroken, tell me the truth!"
neither to you in life, nor to her in eternal death."
His lips writhed, as if the words were coals between them, and a great drop of sweat rolled across the parchment of his forehead. Gabriel Ockram bit his hand as he watched his father die, but Nurse MacDonald spoke a third time.
"By the woman whom you betrayed, and who waits for you this night, Hugh Ockram, tell me the truth!"
"It is too late. Let me die in peace."
The writhing lips began to smile across the set yellow teeth, and the toad eyes glowed like evil jewels in his head.
"There is time," said the ancient woman. "Tell me the name of Evelyn Warburton's father. Then I will let you die in peace."
Evelyn started back, kneeling as she was, and stared at Nurse MacDonald and then at her uncle.
"The name of Evelyn's father?"
he repeated slowly, while the awful smile spread upon his dying face. The light was growing strangely dim in the great room. As Evelyn looked, Nurse MacDonald's crooked shadow on the wall grew gigantic. Sir Hugh's breath came thick, rattling in his throat, as death crept in like a snake and choked it back. Evelyn prayed loud, high, and clear. Then something rapped at the window, and she felt her hair rise upon her head in a cool breeze as she looked around in spite of herself. And when she saw her own white face looking in at the window, and her own eyes staring at her through the glass, wide and fearful, and her own hair streaming against the pane, and her own lips dashed with blood, she rose slowly from the floor and stood rigid for one moment, till she screamed once and fell straight back into Gabriel's arms. But the shriek that answered hers was the fear shriek of the tormented corpse, out of which the soul cannot pass for shame of deadly sins, though the devils fight in it with corruption, each for their due share. Sir Hugh Ockram sat upright in his deathbed and saw and cried aloud,
"Evelyn!"
His harsh voice broke and rattled in his chest as he sank down. But still Nurse MacDonald tortured him, for there was a little life left in him still.
"You have seen the mother as she waits for you, Hugh Ockram. Who was this girl Evelyn's father? What was his name?"
For the last time, the dreadful smile came upon the twisted lips, very slowly, very surely now, and the toad eyes glared red, and the parchment face glowed a little in the flickering light. For the last time, words came.
"They'll know it in hell."
Then the glowing eyes went out quickly. The yellow face turned waxen pale, and a great shiver ran through the thin body as Hugh Ockram died. But in death he still smiled, for he knew his secret and kept it still on the other side, and he would take it with him, to lie with him forever in the north vault of the chapel where the Ockrams lie uncoffined in their shrouds, all but one. Though he was dead, he smiled, for he had kept his treasure of evil truth to the end, and there was none left to tell the name he had spoken, but there was all the evil he had not undone left to bear fruit. As they watched, Nurse MacDonald and Gabriel, who held Evelyn still unconscious in his arms while he looked at the father, they felt the dead smile crawling along their own lips, the ancient crone and the youth with the angel's face. Then they shivered a little, and both looked at Evelyn as she lay with her head on his shoulder, and, though she was very beautiful, the same sickening smile was twisting her young mouth too. It was like the foreshadowing of a great evil which they could not understand. But by and by they carried Evelyn out, and she opened her eyes, and the smile was gone. From far away in the great house, the sound of weeping and crooning came up the stairs and echoed along the dismal corridors, for the women had begun to mourn the dead master after the Irish fashion, and the hall had echoes of its own all that night, like the far-off wail of the banshee among forest trees. When the time was come, they took Sir Hugh in his winding-sheet on a trestle bier, and bore him to the chapel, and through the iron door, and down the long descent to the north vault, with tapers, to lay him by his father. The two men went in first to prepare the place, and came back staggering like drunken men and white, leaving their lights behind them. But Gabriel Ockram was not afraid, for he knew. And he went in alone, and saw that the body of Sir Vernon Ockram was leaning upright against the stone wall, and that his head lay on the ground near by, with the face turned up, and the dry, leathern lips smiled horribly at the dried-up corpse, while the iron coffin, lined with black velvet, stood open on the floor. Then Gabriel took the thing in his hands, for it was very light, being quite dried by the air of the vault, and those who peeped in from the door saw him lay it in the coffin again, and it rustled a little, like a bundle of reeds, and sounded hollow as it touched the sides and the bottom. He also placed the head upon the shoulders and shut down the lid, which fell to with a rusty spring that snapped. After that, they laid Sir Hugh beside his father, with the trestle bier on which they had brought him, and they went back to the chapel. But when they saw one another's faces, master and men, they were all smiling, with the dead smile of the corpse they had left in the vault, so that they could not bear to look at one another until it had faded away. Chapter 3. Gabriel Ockram became Sir Gabriel, inheriting the baronetcy with the half-ruined fortune left by his father, and still Evelyn Warburton lived at Ockram Hall, in the south room that had been hers ever since she could remember anything. She could not go away, for there were no relatives to whom she could have gone, and besides, there seemed to be no reason why she should not stay. The world would never trouble itself to care what the Ockrams did on their Irish estates, and it was long since the Ockrams had asked anything of the world. So Sir Gabriel took his father's place at the dark old table in the dining-room, and Evelyn sat opposite to him, until such time as their mourning should be over, and they might be married at last. And meanwhile their lives went on as before, since Sir Hugh had been a hopeless invalid during the last year of his life, and they had seen him but once a day for a little while, spending most of their time together in a strangely perfect companionship. But though the late summer saddened into autumn, and autumn darkened into winter, and storm followed storm and rain poured on rain through the short days and the long nights, yet Ockram Hall seemed less gloomy since Sir Hugh had been laid in the north vault beside his father. And at Christmastide, Evelyn decked the great hall with holly and green boughs, and huge fires blazed on every hearth. Then the tenants were all bidden to a New Year's dinner, and they ate and drank well, while Sir Gabriel sat at the head of the table. Evelyn came in when the port wine was brought, and the most respected of the tenants made a speech to propose her health. It was long, he said, since there had been a Lady Ockram. Sir Gabriel shaded his eyes with his hand and looked down at the table, but a faint color came into Evelyn's transparent cheeks. But, said the grey-haired farmer, it was longer still since there had been a Lady Ockram so fair as the next was to be, and he gave the health of Evelyn Warburton. Then the tenants all stood up and shouted for her, and Sir Gabriel stood up likewise beside Evelyn. And when the men gave the last and loudest cheer of all, there was a voice not theirs, above them all, higher, fiercer, louder. A scream not earthly, shrieking for the bride of Aughrim Hall, and the holly and green boughs over the great chimney-piece shook and slowly waved as if a cool breeze were blowing over them. But the men turned very pale, and many of them set down their glasses, but others let them fall upon the floor for fear. And looking into one another's faces, they were all smiling, strangely. A dead smile, like dead Sir Hugh's. One cried out words in Irish, and the fear of death was suddenly upon them all, so that they fled in panic, falling over one another like wild beasts in the burning forest, when the thick smoke runs along before the flame, and the tables were overset, and drinking glasses and bottles were broken in heaps, and the dark red wine crawled like blood upon the polished floor. Sir Gabriel and Evelyn stood alone at the head of the table before the wreck of the feast, not daring to turn to see each other, for each knew that the other smiled. But his right arm held her, and his left hand clasped her right, as they stared before them. And but for the shadows of her hair, one might not have told their two faces apart. They listened long, but the cry came not again, and the dead smile faded from their lips, while each remembered that Sir Hugh Aughrim lay in the north vault, smiling in his winding sheet, in the dark, because he had died with his secret. So ended the tenants' New Year's dinner, but from that time on, Sir Gabriel grew more and more silent, and his face grew even paler and thinner than before. Often, without warning and without words, he would rise from his seat as if something moved him against his will, and he would go out into the rain or the sunshine to the north side of the chapel and sit on the stone bench, staring at the ground as if he could see through it, and through the vault below, and through the white winding sheet in the dark, to the dead smile that would not die. Always when he went out in that way, Evelyn came out presently and sat beside him. Once, too, as in summer, their beautiful faces came suddenly near, and their lids drooped, and their red lips were almost joined together. But as their eyes met, they grew wide and wild, so that the white showed in a ring all round the deep violet, and their teeth chattered, and their hands were like hands of corpses, each in the other's, for the terror of what was under their feet, and of what they knew but could not see. Once also, Evelyn found Sir Gabriel in the chapel, alone, standing before the iron door that led down to the place of death, and in his hand there was the key to the door, but he had not put it into the lock. Evelyn drew him away, shivering, for she had also been driven in waking dreams to see that terrible thing again, and to find out whether it had changed since it had lain there. "I'm going mad," said Sir Gabriel, covering his eyes with his hand as he went with her. "I see it in my sleep. I see it when I am awake. It draws me to it, day and night, and unless I see it, I shall die." "I know," answered Evelyn. "I know. It is as if threads were spun from it, like a spider's, drawing us down to it." She was silent for a moment, and then she started violently and grasped his arm with a man's strength and almost screamed the words she spoke. "But we must not go there," she cried. "We must not go." Sir Gabriel's eyes were half shut, and he was not moved by the agony of her face. "I shall die unless I see it again," he said, in a quiet voice not like his own. And all that day and that evening he scarcely spoke, thinking of it, always thinking, while Evelyn Warburton quivered from head to foot with a terror she had never known. She went alone, on a grey winter's morning, to Nurse MacDonald's room in the tower, and sat down beside the great leathern easy-chair, laying her thin white hand upon the withered fingers. "Nurse," she said, "what was it that Uncle Hugh should have told you that night before he died? It must have been an awful secret, and yet though you asked him, I feel somehow that you know it, and that you know why he used to smile so dreadfully." The old woman's head moved slowly from side to side.
"I only guess. I shall never know," she answered slowly, in her cracked little voice.
"But what do you guess? Who am I? Why did you ask who my father was? You know I am Colonel Warburton's daughter, and my mother was Lady Ockram's sister, so that Gabriel and I are cousins. My father was killed in Afghanistan. What secret can there be?"
"I do not know. I can only guess."
"Guess what?"
asked Evelyn imploringly, and pressing the soft, withered hands as she leaned forward. But Nurse MacDonald's wrinkled lids dropped suddenly over her queer blue eyes, and her lips shook a little with her breath, as if she were asleep. Evelyn waited. By the fire the Irish maid was knitting fast, and the needles clicked like 3 or 4 clocks ticking against each other, and the real clock on the wall solemnly ticked alone, checking off the seconds of the woman who was 100 years old, and had not many days left. Outside the ivy branch beat the window in a wintry blast, as it had beaten against the glass 100 years ago. Then, as Evelyn sat there, she felt again the waking of a horrible desire, the sickening wish to go down to the thing in the north vault, and to open the winding sheet and see whether it had changed. And she held Nurse MacDonald's hands as if to keep herself in her place and fight against the appalling attraction to the evil dead. But the old cat that kept Nurse MacDonald's feet warm, lying always on the bag footstool, got up and stretched itself, and looked up into Evelyn's eyes, while its back arched and its tail thickened and bristled, and its ugly pink lips drew back in a devilish grin, showing its sharp teeth. Evelyn stared at it, half fascinated by its ugliness. Then the creature suddenly put out one paw with all its claws spread, and spat at the girl, and all at once the grinning cat was like the smiling corpse far down below, so that Evelyn shivered down to her small feet and covered her face with her free hand, lest Nurse MacDonald should wake and see the dead smile there, for she could feel it. The old woman had already opened her eyes again, and she touched her cat with the end of her crutch stick, whereupon its back went down, and its tail shrunk, and it sidled back on its place on the bag footstool. But its yellow eyes looked up sideways at Evelyn, between the slits of its lids. "What is it that you guess, nurse?" asked the young girl again. "A bad thing. A wicked thing. But I dare not tell you, lest it might not be true, and the very thought should blast your life. For if I guess right, he meant that you should not know, and that you two should marry, and pay for his old sin with your souls."
"He used to tell us that we ought not to marry."
"Yes, he told you that, perhaps. But it was as if a man put poisoned meat before a starving beast and said, 'Do not eat,' but never raised his hand to take the meat away. And if he told you that you should not marry, it was because he hoped you would. For of all men living or dead, Hugh Ockram was the falsest man that ever told a cowardly lie, and the cruelest that ever hurt a weak woman, and the worst that ever loved a sin."
"But Gabriel and I love each other," said Evelyn very sadly.
Nurse MacDonald's old eyes looked far away, at sights seen long ago, and that rose in the grey winter air amid the mists of an ancient youth. "If you love, you can die together," she said very slowly. "Why should you live if it is true? I am 100 years old. What has life given me? The beginning is fire, the end is a heap of ashes, and between the end and the beginning lies all the pain of the world. Let me sleep, since I cannot die." Then the old woman's eyes closed again, and her head sank a little lower upon her breast. So Evelyn went away and left her asleep, with the cat asleep on the bag footstool, and the young girl tried to forget Nurse MacDonald's words, but she could not, for she heard them over and over again in the wind, and behind her on the stairs. And as she grew sick with fear of the frightful unknown evil to which her soul was bound, she felt a bodily something pressing her, and pushing her, and forcing her on, and from the other side she felt the threads that drew her mysteriously, and when she shut her eyes she saw the chapel behind the altar, the low iron door through which she must pass to go to the thing. And as she lay awake at night, she drew the sheet over her face, lest she should see shadows on the wall beckoning to her, and the sound of her own warm breath made whisperings in her ears, while she held the mattress with her hands to keep from getting up and going to the chapel. It would have been easier if there had not been a way thither through the library, by a door which was never locked. It would be fearfully easy to take her candle and go softly through the sleeping house. And the key of the vault lay under the altar, behind a stone that turned. She knew the little secret. She could go alone and see. But when she thought of it, she felt her hair rise on her head, and first she shivered so that the bed shook, and then the horror went through her in a cold thrill that was agony again, like myriads of icy needles boring into her nerves. Chapter 4. The old clock in Nurse MacDonald's tower struck midnight. From her room, she could hear the creaking chains and weights in their box in the corner of the staircase, and overhead the jarring of the rusty lever that lifted the hammer. She had heard it all her life. It struck 11 strokes clearly, and then came the 12th, with a dull half-stroke, as though the hammer were too weary to go on, and had fallen asleep against the bell. The old cat got up from the bag footstool and stretched itself, and Nurse MacDonald opened her ancient eyes and looked slowly round the room by the dim light of the night lamp. She touched the cat with her crutch-stick, and it lay down upon her feet. She drank a few drops from her cup, and went to sleep again. But downstairs, Sir Gabriel sat straight up as the clock struck, for he had dreamed a fearful dream of horror, and his heart stood still, till he awoke at its stopping, and it beat again furiously with his breath, like a wild thing set free. No Ockram had ever known fear waking, but sometimes it came to Sir Gabriel in his sleep. He pressed his hands to his temples as he sat up in bed, and his hands were icy cold, but his head was hot. The dream faded far, and in its place there came the master thought that racked his life. With the thought also came the sick twisting of his lips in the dark that would have been a smile. Far off, Evelyn Warburton dreamed that the dead smile was on her mouth, and awoke, starting with a little moan, her face in her hands, shivering. But Sir Gabriel struck a light, and got up, and began to walk up and down his great room. It was midnight, and he had barely slept an hour, and in the north of Ireland the winter nights are long. "I shall go mad," he said to himself, holding his forehead. He knew that it was true. For weeks and months the possession of the thing had grown upon him like a disease, till he could think of nothing without thinking first of that, and now, all at once, it outgrew his strength,
and he knew that he must be its instrument or lose his mind, that he must do the deed he hated and feared, if he could fear anything, or that something would snap in his brain and divide him from life while he was yet alive. He took the candlestick in his hand, the old-fashioned heavy candlestick that had always been used by the head of the house. He did not think of dressing, but went as he was, in his silk nightclothes and his slippers, and he opened the door. Everything was very still in the great old house. He shut the door behind him and walked noiselessly on the carpet through the long corridor. A cool breeze blew over his shoulder and blew the flame of his candle straight out from him. Instinctively, he stopped and looked around, but all was still, and the upright flame burned steadily. He walked on, and instantly a strong draught was behind him, almost extinguishing the light. It seemed to blow him on his way, ceasing whenever he turned, coming again when he went on, invisible, icy. Down the great staircase to the echoing hall he went, seeing nothing but the flaring flame of the candle standing away from him over the guttering wax, while the cold wind blew over his shoulder and through his hair. On he passed, through the open door into the library, dark with old books and carved bookcases. On, through the door in the shelves, with painted shelves on it, and the imitated backs of books, so that one needed to know where to find it, and to shut itself after him with a soft click. He entered the low-arched passage, and though the door was shut behind him and fitted tightly in its frame, still the cold breeze blew the flame forward as he walked. And he was not afraid, but his face was very pale, and his eyes were wide and bright, looking before him, seeing already in the dark air the picture of the thing beyond. But in the chapel he stood still, his hand on the little turning stone tablet in the back of the stone altar. On the tablet were engraved words: Clavis sepulchri clarissimorum dominorum de Ocrum, the key to the vault of the most illustrious lords of Ocrum. Sir Gabriel paused and listened. He fancied that he heard a sound far off in the great house, where all had been so still, but it did not come again. Yet he waited at the last, and looked at the low iron door. Beyond it, down the long descent, lay his father uncoffined, 6 months dead, corrupt, terrible in his clinging shroud. The strangely preserving air of the vault could not yet have done its work completely. But on the thing's ghastly features, with their half-dried, open eyes, there would still be the frightful smile with which the man had died, the smile that haunted. As the thought crossed Sir Gabriel's mind, he felt his lips writhing, and he struck his own mouth in wrath with the back of his hand so fiercely that a drop of blood ran down his chin, and another, and more, falling back in the gloom upon the chapel pavement. But still his bruised lips twisted themselves. He turned the tablet by the simple secret. It needed no safer fastening, for had each Ocrum been coffined in pure gold, and had the door been opened wide, there was not a man in Tyrone brave enough to go down to that place, saving Gabriel Ocrum himself, with his angel's face and his thin white hands and his sad, unflinching eyes. He took the great old key and set it into the lock of the iron door, and the heavy rattling noise echoed down the descent beyond like footsteps, as if a watcher had stood behind the iron and were running away within, with heavy dead feet. And though he was standing still, the cool wind was from behind him, and blew the flame of the candle against the iron panel. He turned the key. Sir Gabriel saw that his candle was short. There were new ones on the altar, with long candlesticks, and he lit one, and left his own burning on the floor. As he set it down on the pavement, his lip began to bleed again, and another drop fell upon the stones. He drew the iron door open and pushed it back against the chapel wall so that it should not shut itself while he was within, and the horrible draught of the sepulchre came up out of the depths in his face, foul and dark. He went in, but though the fetid air met him, yet the flame of the tall candle was blown straight from him against the wind, while he walked down the easy incline with steady steps, his loose slippers slapping the pavement as he trod. He shaded the candle with his hand, and his fingers seemed to be made of wax and blood as the light shone through them. And in spite of him, the unearthly draught forced the flame forward, till it was blue over the black wick, and it seemed as if it must go out. But he went straight on, with shining eyes. The downward passage was wide, and he could not always see the walls by the struggling light, but he knew when he was in the place of death by the larger, drearier echo of his steps in the greater space, and by the sensation of a distant blank wall. He stood still, almost enclosing the flame of the candle in the hollow of his hand. He could see a little, for his eyes were growing used to the gloom. Shadowy forms were outlined in the dimness, where the biers of the ochrams stood crowded together, side by side, each with its straight, shrouded corpse, strangely preserved by the dry air, like the empty shell that the locust sheds in summer. And a few steps before him he saw clearly the dark shape of headless Sir Vernon's iron coffin, and he knew that nearest to it lay the thing he sought. He was as brave as any of those dead men had been, and they were his fathers, and he knew that sooner or later he should lie there himself, beside Sir Hugh, slowly drying to a parchment shell. But he was still alive, and he closed his eyes a moment, and 3 great drops stood on his forehead. Then he looked again, and by the whiteness of the winding sheet he knew his father's corpse, for all the others were brown with age, and moreover, the flame of the candle was blown toward it. He made 4 steps till he reached it, and suddenly the light burned straight and high, shedding a dazzling yellow glare upon the fine linen that was all white, save over the face, where the joined hands were laid on the breast. And at those places ugly stains had spread, darkened with outlines of the features and of the tight-clasped fingers. There was a frightful stench of drying death. As Sir Gabriel looked down, something stirred behind him, softly at first, then more noisily, and something fell to the stone floor with a dull thud and rolled up to his feet. He started back and saw a withered head lying almost face upward on the pavement, grinning at him. He felt the cold sweat standing on his face, and his heart beat painfully. For the first time in all his life, that evil thing which men call fear was getting hold of him, checking his heartstrings as a cruel driver checks a quivering horse, clawing at his backbone with icy hands, lifting his hair with freezing breath, climbing up and gathering in his midriff with leaden weight. Yet presently he bit his lip and bent down, holding the candle in one hand, to lift the shroud back from the head of the corpse with the other. Slowly he lifted it. Then it clove to the half-dried skin of the face, and his hand shook as if someone had struck him on the elbow, but half in fear and half in anger at himself, he pulled it, so that it came away with a little ripping sound. He caught his breath as he held it, not yet throwing it back, and not yet looking. The horror was working in him, and he felt that old Vernon Ockram was standing up in his iron coffin, headless, yet watching him with the stump of his severed neck. While he held his breath, he felt the dead smile twisting his lips. In sudden wrath at his own misery, he tossed the death-stained linen backward and looked at last. He ground his teeth lest he should shriek aloud. There it was, the thing that haunted him, that haunted Evelyn Warburton. There was like a blight on all that came near him. The dead face was blotched with dark stains, and the thin grey hair was matted about the discolored forehead. The sunken lids were half open, and the candlelight gleamed on something foul where the toad eyes had lived. But yet the dead thing smiled, as it had smiled in life. The ghastly lips were parted and drawn wide and tight upon the wolfish teeth, cursing still, and still defying hell to do its worst, defying, cursing, and always and forever smiling alone in the dark. Sir Gabriel opened the winding sheet where the hands were, and the blackened, withered fingers were closed upon something stained and mottled. Shivering from head to foot, but fighting like a man in agony for his life, he tried to take the package from the dead man's hold. But as he pulled at it, the claw-like fingers seemed to close more tightly, and when he pulled harder, the shrunken hands and arms rose from the corpse with a horrible look of life following his motion. Then as he wrenched the sealed packet loose at last, the hands fell back into their place, still folded. He set down the candle on the edge of the bier to break the seals from the stout paper, and kneeling on one knee to get a better light, he read what was within, written long ago in Sir Hugh's queer hand. He was no longer afraid. He read how Sir Hugh had written it all down that it might perchance be a witness of evil and of his hatred. How he had loved Evelyn Warburton, his wife's sister, and how his wife had died of a broken heart with his curse upon her, and how Warburton and he had fought side by side in Afghanistan, and Warburton had fallen. But Ockram had brought his comrade's wife back a full year later, and little Evelyn, her child, had been born in Ockram Hall. And next, how he had wearied of the mother, and she had died like her sister with his curse on her. And then, how Evelyn had been brought up as his niece, and how he had trusted that his son Gabriel and his daughter, innocent and unknowing, might love and marry, and the souls of the women he had betrayed might suffer another anguish before eternity was out. And last of all, he hoped that some day, when nothing could be undone, the two might find his writing and live on, not daring to tell the truth for their children's sake and the world's word, man and wife. This he read, kneeling beside the corpse in the north vault, by the light of the altar candle. And when he had read it all, he thanked God aloud that he had found the secret in time. But when he rose to his feet and looked down at the dead face, it was changed, and the smile was gone from it forever, and the jaw had fallen a little, and the tired dead lips were relaxed. And then there was a breath behind him and close to him, not cold, like that which had blown the flame of the candle as he came, but warm and human. He turned suddenly. There she stood, all in white, with her shadowy golden hair, for she had risen from her bed and had followed him noiselessly, and had found him reading, and had herself read over his shoulder. He started violently when he saw her, for his nerves were unstrung, and then he cried out her name in the still place of death. "Evelyn!" "My brother," she answered softly and tenderly, putting out both hands to meet his. This is B.J. Harrison. I hope you've enjoyed this unabridged production of The Dead Smile by F. Marion Crawford. If you have enjoyed this book, please become a monthly supporter by going to ClassicTalesAudiobooks.com. Donate $5 a month and get a monthly coupon code for $8 off anything in the store. Improving literacy is what we're all about. Thanks for pitching in. Continue listening to hear a healthy sample of Bellarion the Fortunate by Raphael Sabatini. Thank you for joining me today and allowing classic literature to awaken your better self. Please join me every week, and we'll rediscover the greatest stories ever put to paper. Chapter 3. The Door Ajar. The event, which was to deviate Bellarion so abruptly and brutally from the peaceful ways of a student and a scholar, and to extinguish his cherished hopes of learning Greek at Pavia under the far-famed Messer Chrysolaris, was upon him so suddenly and so unheralded that he scarcely realized it until it was overpast. He and the friar had supped in the unclean and crowded common room of the hostelry of the Stag, so called, it is presumed, in honor of the lords of Montferrat, who had adopted the Stag as their device, and it is to be confessed that they had supped abundantly and well under the particular auspices of Ser Benvenuto the host, who used his cousin Fra Sulpizio with almost more than cousinly affection. He had placed them a little apart from the noisy occupants of that low-ceilinged, grimy chamber, in a recess under a tall, narrow window, standing open, so that the stench, compounded of garlic, burnt meats, rancid oil, and other things, which pervaded the apartment, was here diluted for them by the pure evening air. And he waited upon them himself, after a protracted entertainment with the friar, conducted in a mutter of which nothing reached Bellarion. He brought them of his best, of which the most conspicuous item was a lean and stringy fowl, and he produced for them from his cellar a flask of Valtelline, which at least was worthy of a better table. Bellarion, tired and hungry, did justice to the viands, without permitting himself more than a passing irritation at his companion's whining expositions of the signal advantages of traveling under the aegis of the Blessed Francis. The truth is that he did not hear more than the half of all that Fra Sulpizio found occasion to urge. For one thing, in his greed, the friar spoke indistinctly, slobbering the while at his food. For another, the many tenants of the inn were very noisy. They made up a motley crowd, but had this in common: they all belonged to the lower walks of life, as their loud, coarse speech, freely interlarded with blasphemy and obscenity, abundantly bore witness. There were some peasants from Romalia or Torcella, or perhaps from Terranova beyond the Po, who had come there to market, rude, brawny men for the most part, accompanied by their equally brawny, bare-legged women. There were a few laborers of the town and others who may have been artisans, one or two of them, indeed, so proclaimed by their leather aprons, and at one table a group of 4 men and a woman were very boisterous over their wine. The men were soldiers, so to be judged at a glance from their leather hacquetons and studded girdles with heavy daggers slung behind. The woman with them was a gaudy, sinuous creature with haggard, painted cheeks, whose mirth, now shrill, now raucous, was too easily moved. When first he heard it, Bellarion had shuddered. "She laughs," he had told the friar, "as one might laugh in hell." For only answer, Fra Sulpizio had looked at him and then veiled his eyes, almost as if himself he were suppressing laughter. Soon, however, Bellarion grew accustomed to the ever-recurring sound and to the rest of the din, the rattle of platters and drinking cans, the growling of a dog over a bone it had discovered among the foul rushes rotting on the bare earthen floor. Having eaten, he sat back in his chair, a little torpid now and drowsy. Last night he had lain in the open, and he had been afoot almost since dawn. It is little wonder that presently, whilst again the taverner was muttering with his cousin the friar, he should have fallen into a doze. He must have slept some little while, a half-hour perhaps, for when he awakened, the patch of sunlight had faded from the wall across the alley, visible from the window under which they sat. This he did not notice at the time, but remembered afterwards. In the moment of awakening, his attention was drawn by the friar, who had risen and instantly afterwards by something else beyond the friar. At the open window behind and above Fra Sulpizio, there was the face of a man. Upon the edge of the sill, beneath his face, were visible the fingers by which he had hoisted himself thither. The questing eyes met Bellarion's, and seemed to dilate a little. The mouth gaped suddenly. But before Bellarion could cry out or speak, or even form the intention of doing either, the face had vanished, and it was the face of the peasant with whom they had dined that day. The friar, warned by Bellarion's quickening stare, had swung round to look behind him, but he was too late. The window space was already empty. "What is it?" he asked, suddenly apprehensive. "What did you see?" Bellarion told him, and was answered by an obscenely morphological oath, which left him staring. The friar's countenance was suddenly transfigured. A spasm of mingled fear and anger bared his fangs. His beady eyes grew cruel and sinister. He swung aside as if to depart abruptly, then, as abruptly, halted where he stood. On the threshold surged the peasant, others following him. The friar sank again to his stool at the table and composed his features. "Yonder he sits, that friar rogue, that thief!" Thus the peasant as he advanced. The cry, and more than all the sight of the peasant's companions, imposed a sudden silence upon the babble of that room. First came a young man, stalwart and upright, in steel cap and gorget, booted and spurred, a sword swinging from his girdle, a dagger hanging on his hip behind, a little crimson feather adorning his steel cap, proclaiming him an officer of the captain of justice of Casale. After him came two of his men, armed with short pikes. Straight to that table in the window recess, the peasant led the way. "There he is! There is he!" Belligerently he thrust his face into the friar's, leaning his knuckles on the table's edge. "Now, rogue," he was beginning furiously, when Fra Sulpizio, raising eyes of mild astonishment to meet his anger, gently interrupted him. "Little brother, do you speak so to me? Do you call me rogue? Me?" He smiled sadly, and so calm and gently wistful was his manner that it clearly gave the peasant pause. "A sinner I confess myself, for sinners are we all. But I am conscious of no sin against you, brother, whose charity was so freely given me only today." That saintly demeanor threw the peasant's simple wits into confusion. He was thrust aside by the officer. "What is your name?" Fra Sulpizio looked at him, and his look was laden with reproach. "My brother," he cried. "Attend to me!" the officer barked at him. "This man charges you with theft." "With theft?" Fra Sulpizio paused and sighed. "It shall not move me to the sin of anger, brother. It is too foolish, a thing for laughter. What need have I to steal, when under the protection of St. Francis I have but to ask for the little that I need? What use to me is worldly gear, and what does he say I stole?" It was the peasant who answered him. 30 florins, a gold chain, and a silver cross from a chest in the room where you rested." Bellarion remembered how the friar had sought to go slinking off alone from the peasant homestead, and how fearfully he had looked behind him as they trudged along the road until overtaken by the muleteer. And by the muleteer it would be, he thought, that they had now been tracked. The officer at the gate would have told the peasant of how the friar and his young companion in greed had ridden in. Then the peasant would have sought the muleteer, and the rest was clear. As clear as it was to him that his companion was a thieving rogue, and that his own 5 ducats were somewhere about that scoundrel's person. In future, he swore, he would be guided by his own keen instincts and the evidence of his senses only, and never again allow a preconception to befool him. Meanwhile, the friar was answering. "So that not only am I charged with stealing, but I have returned evil for good. I have abused charity. It is a heavy charge, my brother, and very rashly brought." There was a murmur of sympathy from the staring, listening company, amongst whom many lawless ones were, by the very instinct of their kind, ready to rage themselves against any who stood for law. The friar opened his arms, wide and invitingly. "Let me not depart from my vows of humility in the heat of my own defense. I will say nothing. Do you, sir, make search upon me for the gear which this man says I have stolen, though all his evidence is that it chanced to be in a room in which for a little while I rested."
"To accuse a priest,"
said someone in a tone of indignation, and a murmur arose at once in sympathy. It moved the young officer to mirth. He half swung on his heel so as to confront these mutterers.
"A priest," he jeered.
Then his keen eyes flashed once more upon the friar.
"When did you last say Mass?"
Before that simple question, Fra Sulpizio seemed to lose some of his assurance. Without even giving him time to answer, the officer fired another question.
"What is your name?"
"My name?" The friar was looking at him from eyes that seemed to have grown beadier than ever in that white, pitted face. "I'll not expose myself to a bold unbelief. You shall have written proof of my name. Behold!" And from his gown he fetched a parchment, which he thrust under the soldier's nose. The officer conned it a moment. Then his eyes went over the edge of it, back to the face of the man that held it.
"How can I read it upside down?"
The friar's hands, which shook a little, made haste to turn the sheet. As he did so, Bellarion perceived two things: that the sheet had been correctly held at first, and that it was his own lost letter. He had a glimpse of the abbot's seal as the parchment was turned. He was momentarily bewildered by a discovery that was really threefold. First, the friar was indeed the thief who had rifled his scrip. Second, he must be in a more desperate case than Bellarion suspected, to seek to cloak himself under a false identity. And third, the pretense that the document proffered upside down was a test to discover whether the fellow could read, a trap into which the knave had tumbled headlong. The officer laughed aloud, well pleased at his own cleverness.
"I knew you were no clerk," he mocked him. "I have more than a suspicion who you really are. Though you may have stolen a friar's habit, it would need more than that to cover your ugly pock-marked face and that scar on your neck. You are Lorenzaccio da Trino, my friend, and there's a halter waiting for you."
The mention of that name made a stir in the tavern, and brought its tenants to a step nearer to the group about that table in the window recess. It was a name known probably to every man present, with the single exception of Bellarion, the name of a bandit of evil fame throughout Montferrat and Savoy. Something of the kind Bellarion may have guessed, but at that moment the recovery of the abbot's letter was his chief concern. "That parchment's mine," he cried. "It was stolen from me this morning by this false friar." The interpolation diverted attention to himself. After a moment's blank stare, the officer laughed again. Bellarion began actively to dislike that laugh of his. He was too readily moved to it.
"Why, here's Paul disowning Peter. Oh, to be sure, the associate becomes the victim when the master rogue is taken. It's a stale trick, young cockerel. It won't serve in Casale."
Bellarion bristled. He assumed a great dignity. "Young sir, you may come to regret your words. I am the man named in that parchment, as the abbot of the Grazie of Ciliano can testify."
"No need to plague Messer the abbot," the officer mocked him. "A taste of the cord, my lad, a hoist or two, and you'll vomit all the truth."
"The hoist?" Bellarion felt the skin roughening along his spine. Was it to be taken for granted that he was a rogue, simply from his association with this spurious friar? And were his bones to be broken by the torturers to make him accuse himself? Was this how justice was dispensed? He was bewildered, and as he afterwards confessed, he grew suddenly afraid. And then there was a cry from the peasant, and things happened quickly and unexpectedly. Whilst the officer's attention had been on Bellarion, the false friar had moved very soft and stealthily nearer to the window. The peasant it was who detected the movement and realized its import. "Lay hands on him!" he cried, in sudden alarm, lest his florins and the rest should take flight again. And, that alarm spurring him, himself he leapt to seize Lorenzaccio by arm and shoulder. Fury blazed from the bandit's beady eyes. His yellow fangs were bared in a grin of rage. Something flashed in his right hand, and then his knife sank into the stomach of his assailant. It was a wicked, vicious, upward, ripping thrust, like the stroke of a boar's tusk, and the very movement that delivered it flung the peasant off, so that he hurtled into the arms of the two soldiers, and momentarily hampered their advance. That moment was all that Lorenzaccio needed. He swung aside, and with the vigor and agility to execute, as remarkable as the rapidity of the conception itself, he hoisted himself to the sill of the narrow open window, crouched there a second, measuring his outward leap, and was gone. He left a raging confusion behind him, and an exclamatory din above, which rang fierce and futile commands from the podesta's young officer. One of the men-at-arms supported the swooning body of the peasant, whilst his fellow vainly and stupidly sought to follow by the way Lorenzaccio had gone, but failed because he lacked the bandit's vigor. Bellarion, horror-stricken and half-stupefied, stood staring at the wretched peasant whose hurt he judged to be mortal. He was roused by a gentle tugging at his sleeve. He half-turned to find himself looking into the painted face of the woman whose laughter earlier had jarred his sensibilities. It was a handsome face, despite the tawdriness it derived from the raddled cheeks and two vividly reddened lips. The girl, she was little more, looked kindly concern upon him out of dark, slanting eyes that were preternaturally bright. "Away, away!" she muttered feverishly. "This is your chance. Bestir!" "My chance?" he echoed, and was conscious of the color mounting to his cheeks. His first emotion was resentment of this misjudgment. His next a foolish determination to stand firm and advance his explanations, insisting upon justice being done him. All this whilst he had flung his question, "My chance?" With the next heartbeat, he perceived the strength of the appearances against him. This poor drab, these evil ones about her and him, offering him their sympathy only because they believed him, made kin with them by evil, advised the only course a sane man in his case must follow. "Make haste, child," the woman urged him breathlessly. "Quick, or it will be too late." He looked beyond her at the others crowding there, to meet glances that seemed to invite, to urge, and from one bloated face, which he recognized for Benvenuto's, came an eloquent wink, whilst the fellow jerked a dirty thumb backwards towards the door in a gesture there was no misunderstanding. Then, as if Bellarion's sudden resolve had been reflected in his face, the press before him parted. Men and women shouldered and elbowed a way for him. He plunged forward. The company closed behind him, opening farther ahead, closed ahead as he advanced, and again opened before him, until his way to the door was clear. And behind him he could hear the young officer's voice raised above the din in oaths and imprecations, urging his men-at-arms to clear away with their pikes, calling upon those other soldiers lounging there to lend a hand, so as to make sure, at least, of one of these two rogues. But that rascally company, it seemed, was skilled in the tactics the occasion needed. Honest men there may have been, and no doubt there were amongst them, but they were outnumbered, and moreover, honest though they might be, they were poor folk, and therefore so far in sympathy perhaps with an unfortunate lad as not to hinder him, even if they would not actively help. And meanwhile others, making pretense of being no more than spectators, solicitous for the condition of the peasant who had been stabbed, pressed so closely about the officer and his men that the latter had no room in which to swing their pikes. All this Bellarion guessed, by the sounds behind him rather than saw, for he gave no more than a single backward glance at that seething group as he flung across the threshold out of that evil-smelling chamber into the clean air of the square. He turned to the left and made off towards the cathedral, his first thought being to seek sanctuary there. Then, realizing that thus he would but walk into a trap, he dived down an alley just as the officer gained the tavern door, and with a view-halloo started after him, his 2 pikemen and the other soldiers clattering at his heels. As Bellarion raced like a stag before hounds down that narrow street of mean houses in the shadow of Liutprand's great church, it may well be that he recalled the abbot's parting words, Pax multa in cella, foris autem plurima bella, and wished himself back in the tranquillity of the cloisters, secure from the perils and vexations of secular existence. This breathless flight of his seemed to him singularly futile and purposeless. He knew what he was running from, but not what he might be running to, nor indeed whither to run at all. And for escape, knowledge of the latter is as important as of the former. Had not instinct, the animal instinct of self-preservation, been stronger than his reason, he would have halted, saved his breath, and waited for his pursuers to overtake him. For he was too intelligent to wear himself in attempting to escape the inescapable. Fortunately for him, the instinct of the hunted animal sent him headlong forward in despite of reason. And presently there was reason, too, to urge him. This, when he realized that, after all, his pursuers were not as fleet of foot as himself. Be it from their heavy boots and other accoutrements, be it from his greater youth and more Spartan habits of life, he was rapidly outdistancing them, and thus might yet succeed in shaking them off altogether. Then, too, he reflected that if he kept a straight course in his flight, he must end by reaching the wall of this accursed city, and by following this must gain one of the gates into the open country. It was close on sunset, but there would be at least a full hour yet before the gates were closed. Heartened, he sped on, and only once was he in any danger. That was when the straight course he laid himself brought him out upon an open square, along one side of which ran a long gray building with a noble arcade on the ground level. There was a considerable concourse of people moving here, both in the open and under the arches, and several turned to stare at that lithe, green figure as it sped past. Caring nothing what any might think, and concerned only to cross that open space as quickly as possible, Bellarion gained the narrow streets beyond. Still intent upon keeping a straight line, he turned neither to right nor to left, and presently he found himself moving no longer between houses, but along a grass-grown lane, between high brown walls, where the ground underfoot was soft and moist. He eased the pace a little, to give his aching lungs relief, nor knew how nearly spent he was until the peace of his surroundings induced that lessening of effort. It lessened further, until he was merely walking, panting now, and gasping, and mopping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He had been too reckless, he now told himself. The pace had been too hot. He should have known that it must defeat him. Unless by now he had shaken off those pursuers, or others they might have enlisted, and that was his greatest fear, he was a lost man. He came to a standstill, listening. He could hear, he fancied, sounds in the distance, which warned him that the pursuit still held. Panic spurred his flanks again. But though it might be urgent to resume his flight, it was more urgent still to pause first to recover breath. He had come to a halt beside a stout oaken door which was studded with great nails and set in a deep archway in that high wall. To take his moment's rest, he leaned against these solid timbers, and then, to his amazement, under the weight of his body, the ponderous door swung inwards, so that he almost fell through it into the space of lawn and rose-beds narrowly enclosed within tall boxwood hedges, which were very dense and trimly cut. It was as if a miracle had happened, as if that door had been unlocked for his salvation by supernatural agency. Thus thought he in that moment of exaggerated reaction from his panic, nor stayed to reflect that in entering and in closing and bolting that door, he was as likely to entrap as to deliver himself. There was a deep sill, some 2 feet above the ground, on the inner side. On this Bellarion sat down to indulge the luxury of a sense of security. But not for very long. Presently steps, quick and numerous, came pattering down that lane, to an accompaniment of breathless voices. Bellarion listened, and smiled a little. They would never guess that he had found this door ajar. They would pass on, continuing their now fruitless quest, while he could linger until night descended. Perhaps he would spend the night there, and be off in the morning by the time the gates of the city should have been reopened. Thus he proposed. And then the steps outside came to a sudden halt, and his heart almost halted with them.
He paused hereabouts,
said a gruff voice.
Look at the trodden ground.
That was a shrew-eyed sleuth, thought Bellarion, as he listened fearfully.
Does it matter? Quoth another. Will you stand pausing too whilst he makes off? Come on! He went this way, we know.
Hold, numbskull.
It was the gruff voice again.
He came this way, but he went no farther. Peace, don't argue with me, man. Use your eyes. It's plain to see. No one has gone past this door today. He's here.
And on the word, a heavy blow, as from a pike butt, smote the timbers, and brought Bellarion to his feet, as if he himself had been struck.
But this door is always locked, and he could scarcely have climbed the wall.
He's here, I say. Don't argue. 2 men to guard the door, lest he come forth again. The rest with me to the palace. Come.
His voice was harsh and peremptory. There were no further words in answer. Steps moved off quickly, returning up the lane. Steps paced outside the door, and there was a mutter of voices of the men placed on guard. Bellarion wondered if prayer would help him. He could think of nothing else that would. Chapter 4. Sanctuary. The grounds into which he had stepped through that doorway in the red wall seemed, so far as the tall hedges of his hortus inclusus would permit him to discover, to be very spacious. Somewhere in their considerable extent there would surely be a hiding place into which he could creep until the hunt was over. He went forward to investigate, stepping cautiously towards a deep archway cut in the dense boxwood. In this archway he paused to survey a prospect that evoked thoughts of paradise. Beyond a wide sweep of lawn, whereon 2 peacocks strutted, sparkled the waters of a miniature lake, where a pavilion of white marble, whose smooth dome and graceful pillars suggested a diminutive Roman temple, appeared to float. Access to this was gained from the shore by an arched marble bridge, over whose white parapet trailing geraniums flamed. From this high place the ground fell away in a flight of 2 terraces, and the overflow from the lake went cascading over granite boulders into tanks of granite set in each of them, with shading vine trellises above that were heavy now with purple fruit. Below, another emerald lawn was spread, sheltered on 3 sides within high walls of yew, fantastically cut at the summit into the machicolations of an embattled parapet, and bearing at intervals deep-arched niches, in which marble statues gleamed white against the dusky green. Here figures sauntered, courtly figures of men and women more gaudy and glittering in their gay raiment than the peacocks nearer at hand, and faintly on the still warm air of evening came the throbbing of a lute, which one of them was idly thrumming. Beyond, on the one open side, another shallow terrace rose, and upon this a great red house that was half palace, half fortress, flanked at each side by a massive round tower with covered battlements. So much Bellarion's questing eyes beheld, and then he checked his breath, for his sharp ears had caught the sound of a stealthy step just beyond the hedge that screened him. An instant later he was confronted by a woman who, with something furtive and cautious in her movements, appeared suddenly before him in the archway. For a half-dozen heartbeats they stood thus, each regarding the other, and the vision of her in that breathless moment was destined never to fade from Bellarion's mind. She was of middle height, and her close-fitting gown of sapphire blue laced in gold from neck to waist revealed her to be slender. There was about her an air of delicate dignity, of command tempered by graciousness. For the rest, her hair was of a tawny golden, a shade deeper than the golden threads of the jeweled caul in which it was confined. Her face was small and pale, too long in the nose perhaps for perfect symmetry, yet for that very reason the more challenging in its singular, elusive beauty. Great, wistful eyes of brown, wide-set and thoughtful, were charged with questions as they conned Bellarion. They were singularly searching, singularly compelling eyes, and they drew from him forthwith a frank confession. "Lady," he faltered, "of your charity, I am pursued." "Pursued?" She moved a step, and her expression changed. The wistfulness was replaced by concern in those great, somber eyes. "I am likely to be hanged if taken," he added to quicken the excellent emotions he detected. "By whom are you pursued?" "An officer of the captain of justice and his men." He would have added more. He would have said something to assure her that in seeking her pity, he sought it for an innocent man betrayed by appearances. But she gave signs that her pity needed no such stimulant. She made a little gesture of distraction, clasping her long tapering hands, over which the tight blue sleeves descended to the knuckles. She flung a swift, searching glance behind her, from the green archway to the open spaces. "Come," she said, and beckoned him forward. "I will hide you." And then on a note of deeper anxiety, for which he blessed her tender, charitable heart, she added, "If you are found here, all is lost. Crouch low and follow me." Obediently he followed, almost on all fours, creeping beside the balustrade of mellow brick that stood breast-high to make a parapet for the edge of that very spacious terrace. Ahead of him, the lady moved sedately and unhurried, thereby discovering to Bellarion virtues of mental calm and calculating wit. A fool, he told himself, would have gone in haste, and thus provoked attention and inquiry. They came in safety to the foot of the arched marble bridge, which Bellarion now perceived to be crossed by broad steps, ascending to a platform at the summit, and descending thence again to the level of the temple on the water. "Wait. Here we must go with care." She turned to survey the gardens below, and as she looked, he saw her blench, saw the golden brown eyes dilate as if in fear. He could not see what she saw, the glint of arms upon hurrying men emerging from the palace, but the guess he made went near enough to the fact before she cried out, "Too late. If you ascend now, you will be seen." And she told him of the soldiers. Again she gave evidence of her shrewd sense. "Do you go first," she bade him, "and on hands and knees. If I follow, I may serve as a screen for you, and we must hope they will not see you." "The hope," said Bellarion, "is slender as the screen your slenderness would afford me, lady." He was lying now flat on the ground at her feet. "If only it had pleased heaven to make you as fat as you are charitable, I'd not hesitate. As it is, I think I see a better way." She stared down at him, a little frown puckering her white brow. But for the third time in that brief space, she proved herself a woman whose mind seized upon essentials and disregarded lesser things. "A better way? What way, then?" He had been using his eyes. Beyond the domed pavilion, a tongue of land thrust out into the lake, from which 3 cypresses rose in black silhouette against the afterglow of sunset, whilst a little alder bush, its branches trailing in the water, blunted the island's point. "This way," said Bellarion, and went writhing like an eel in the direction of the water. "Where will you go?" she cried, and added sharply as he reached the edge, "It is very deep, 2 fathoms at the shallowest." So much the better, said Bellarion. They'll be the less likely to seek me in it. He took a succession of deep breaths to prepare him for the long submersion. "Ah, but wait!" she cried on a strained note. "Tell me at least—" She broke off with a catch in her breath. He was gone. He had slipped in, taking the water quietly as an otter, and save for the wave that sped across the lake, no sign of him remained. The lady stood breathlessly at gaze, waiting to see the surface broken by his emerging head. But she waited vainly and in growing alarm. The moments passed. Voices behind her became audible and grew in volume. The men-at-arms were advancing swiftly, the courtiers following to see the sport their captain promised. Suddenly, from the alder bush on the island's point, a startled water-hen broke forth in squawking terror and went scudding across the lake, its feet trailing along the water, into which it finally splashed again within a yard of the farther shore. From within the bush itself, some slight momentary disturbance sent a succession of ripples across the lesser ripples whipped up by the evening breeze. Then all grew still again, including the alarms of the watching lady who had perceived and read these signs. She drew closer about her white, slender shoulders a little mantle edged with miniver, and moved like one impelled by natural curiosity to meet the soldiers who came surging up the terrace steps. There were 4 of them, led by that same young officer who had invaded the hostelry of the Stag in quest of Lorenzaccio. "What is this?" the lady greeted him, her tone a little hard, as if his abrupt invasion of her garden were in itself an offense. "What are you seeking here?"
"A man, Madonna,"
the captain answered her shortly, having at the moment no breath for more. Her somber eyes went past him to dwell upon the 3 glittering gallants in the courtly group of 5 that followed at the soldiers' heels. "A man?" she echoed. "I do not remember to have seen such a portent hereabouts in days." Of the 3 at whom the shaft of her irony was directed, 2 laughed outright in shameless sycophancy. The 3rd flushed scarlet, his glance resentful. He was the youngest by some years, and still a boy. He had her own brown eyes and tawny hair, and otherwise resembled her, save that his countenance lacked the firm strength that might be read in hers. His slim, graceful, stripling figure was gorgeously arrayed in a kilted tunic of gold brocade, with long, green, deeply foliated sleeves, the ends of which reached almost to his toes. His girdle was of hammered gold, whence hung a poniard with a jeweled hilt, and a ruby glowed in his bulging cap of green silk. One of his legs was cased in green, the other in yellow, and he wore a green shoe on the yellow foot and a yellow on the green. This, in the 16th year of his age, was the Lord Gian Giacomo Paleologo, sovereign Marquis of Montferrat. His 2 male companions were Messer Corsario, his tutor, a foxy-faced man of 30, whose rich purple gown would have been more proper to a courtier than a pedant, and the Lord Castruccio da Fenestrella, a young man of perhaps 25, very gorgeous in a scarlet houppelande, and not unhandsome, despite his pallid cheeks, thin lank hair, and rather shifty eyes. It was upon him that Giacomo now turned in peevishness. "Do not laugh, Castruccio." Meanwhile, the captain was flinging out an arm in command to his followers. "2 of you to search the enclosure yonder about the gate. Beat up the hedges. 2 of you with me." He swung to the lady before she could answer her brother. "You have seen no one, Highness?" Her Highness was guilty of an evasion. "Should I not tell you if I had?" "Yet a man certainly entered here not many minutes since by the garden door." "You saw him enter?" "I saw clear signs that he had entered." "Signs? What signs?" He told her. Her mobile lips expressed a doubt before she uttered it. "A poor warrant for this intrusion, Ser Bernabo." The captain grew uncomfortable. "Highness, you mistake my motives." "I hope I do," she answered lightly, and turned her shoulder to him. He commanded his 2 waiting followers. The others were already in the enclosed garden. "To the temple!" At that she turned again, her eyes indignant. "Without my leave? The temple, sir, is my own private bower." The captain hesitated, ill at ease.
"Hardly at present, Highness. It is in the hands of the workmen, and this fellow may be hiding there."
"He is not. He could not be in the temple without my knowledge. I am but come from there."
"Your memory, Highness, is at fault. As I approached, you were coming along the terrace from the enclosed garden."
She flushed under the correction, and there was a pause before she slowly answered him. "Your eyes are too good, Bernardo." In a tone that made him change countenance, she added, "I shall remember it, together with your reluctance to accept my word." Contemptuously, she dismissed him. "Pray make your search without regard for me." The captain stood a moment, hesitating. Then he bowed stiffly from the hips, tossed his head in silent command to his men, and so led them off, over the marble bridge. After he had drawn blank, like the soldiers he had sent to search the enclosure, he returned, baffled, with his 4 fellows at his heels. The Princess Valeria wandered now in company with those other gay ones along the terrace by the balustrade. "You come empty-handed, then?" she rallied him.
"I stake my life he entered the garden," said the captain sullenly.
"You are wise in staking something of no value." He disregarded alike the taunt and the titter it drew from her companions.
"I must report to His Highness. Do you say positively, Madonna, that you did not see this fellow?"
"Lord, man, do you still presume to question me? Besides, if you're so confident, why waste time in questions? Continue your search." The captain addressed himself to her companions.
"You, sirs and ladies, did you have no glimpse of this knave, a tall youngster, dressed in green?"
"In green?" cried the Lady Valeria. "Now that is interesting. In green? A dryad, perhaps, or perhaps my brother here." The captain shook his head.
"That is not possible."
"Nor am I in green," added the young Marquis. "Nor have I been outside the garden. She mocks you, Messer Bernardo. It is her cursed humour. We have seen no one."
"Nor you, Messer Corsario."
Pointedly now, the captain addressed the pedant, as by his years and office the likeliest to return him a serious answer.
"Indeed, no," the gentleman replied. "But then," he added, "we were some way off, as you observed. Madonna, however, who was up here, asserts that she saw no one." "Ah, but does she so assert it?" the captain insisted.
The Lady Valeria looked him over in chill disdain. "You all heard what I said. Repetition is a weariness."
"You see?" the captain appealed to them.
Her brother came to his assistance. "Why can't you answer plainly and have done, Valeria? Why must you forever remember to be witty? Why can't you just say no?" "Because I've answered plainly enough already, and my answer has been disregarded. Sir Bernardo shall have no opportunity to repeat an offence I am not likely to forget." She turned away. "Come, dear Narr, and you, Isotta. It is growing chill." With her ladies obediently following her, she descended towards the lower gardens and the palace. Messer Bernardo stroked his chin, a man nonplussed. The Lord Castruccio chided him. "You're a fool, Bernardo, to anger her highness. Besides, man, what mare's nest are you hunting?" The soldier was pale with vexation.
"You saw as I did, that as we crossed the gardens, her highness was coming from that enclosure." "Yes, booby," said Corsario, "and we saw, as you did, that she came alone. If a man entered by that gate, as you say, he got no farther than the enclosed garden, and this your men have searched already. You gain nothing by betraying suspicions. Who and what do you suppose this man?" "Suppose? I know."
"What do you know?" "That he is a rogue, a brigand scoundrel, associate of Lorenzaccio da Trino, who slipped through our fingers an hour ago." "By the host, cried Corsario in genuine surprise. "I thought—" He checked abruptly and dissembled the break by a laugh. "And can you dream that the Lady Valeria would harbour a robber?"
"Can I dream? Can any man dream what the Lady Valeria will do?"
"I could dream that she'll put your eyes out if ever the power is hers,"
lisped the Lord of Fenestrella with the malice that was of his nature.
"You heard her say they are too good, and that she'll remember it. You should be less ready to tell her all you see. He is a fool who helps to make a woman wise."
The Marquis laughed to applaud his friend's philosophy, and his glance approved him fawningly. The young soldier considered them.
"Sir, I will resume my search."
When they had searched until night closed in upon the world, investigating every hedge and bush that might afford concealment, the captain came to think that either he had been at fault in concluding that the fugitive had sought shelter in the garden, or else the rogue had found some way out and was now beyond their reach. He retired crestfallen, and the three gentlemen who had accompanied his search, and who did not conceal their amusement at its failure, went in to supper. Chapter 5. The Princess. At about the time that the young Lord of Montferrat was sitting down belatedly to table with his tutor and his gentleman-in-waiting, a very bedraggled and chilled Bellarion, who for 2 hours had been standing immersed to the chin in water, his head amid the branches of the alder bush, came cautiously forth at last. He ventured no farther, however, than the shallow tongue of land behind the marble pavilion, ready at the first alarm to plunge back into his watery concealment. There he lay, shivering in the warm night, and taking stock of his plight, an exercise which considerably diminished him in his self-confidence and self-esteem. Experience, he had been wont to say, being rather addicted, I gather, to the making of epigrammic formulae, is the horn-book of fools, unnecessary for the practical purposes of life to the man of wit. It is possible that he was tempted to revise this dictum in the light of the events of that disastrous day, recognizing that a little of the worldly experience he despised might have saved him most, if not all, of its disasters. If he admitted this without yet admitting the fallacy of his aphorism, it was only to reach a conclusion even more humiliating. He had strayed from lack of experience. Therefore it followed, he told himself, that he was a fool. That is one of the dangers of reasoning by syllogism. He had accepted the companionship of a man whose face pronounced him a scoundrel, and whose various actions in the course of the day confirmed the message of his face, and this for no better reason than that the man wore a Franciscan's frock. If his sense did not apprise him that a Franciscan's habit does not necessarily cover a St. Francis, there was a well-known proverb, cuculum non facit monachum, a hood does not make a monk, which he might have remembered. Because sense and memory had alike failed him, he had lost his purse, he had lost the letter which was his passport for the long and arduous journey before him, he had narrowly escaped losing his liberty, and he would be lucky if he were quit of all this mischief without losing his life. The lesser evils of the ruin of a serviceable suit of clothes, and the probability of taking a room as the result of his immersion, went for the moment disregarded. Next he considered the rashness, the senselessness, of his seeking sanctuary in this garden. Was worldly experience really necessary, he wondered, to teach a man that the refuge of which he does not know the exit may easily become a trap? Had he not excelled at the grazie as a chess player from his care and ability in pondering the moves that must follow the immediate one? Had he read, amongst other works on the art of war, which had ever held his mind in fascination, the De Re Militari of Silvius Faustus, to so little purpose that he could not remember one of its first axioms, to the effect that he is an imprudent leader who goes into action without making sure that his line of retreat is open? By such questions as these did Bellarion chastise himself, as he crouched shivering in the dark. Still lower did he crouch, making himself one with the earth itself, when presently a moon, like a golden slice of melon, emerged from behind the black bulk of the palace, and shed a ghostly radiance upon those gardens. He set himself then at last to seek a course by which he might extricate himself from this trap, and from this city of Casale. He was still far from any solution of that problem, when a sound of voices recalled him to more immediate things. Two figures mounting the steps of the terrace had to him the appearance of two black human silhouettes that were being slowly pushed up out of the ground. Their outline defined them for women, even before he made out their voices to be feminine. He wondered, would one of them be the gracious and beautiful lady who had given him sanctuary? A lady whose like hitherto he had seen only painted on canvas above altars and in mural frescoes, the existence of whose living earthly counterparts had been to him a matter of some subconscious doubt. At the height of the bridge, so tremulously reflected in silver on the black water below, the ladies paused, speaking the while in subdued voices. Then they came down the nearer steps and vanished into the temple, whence presently one of them emerged upon that narrow, shallow promontory, calling softly and very vaguely, "Hola, hola, messer, messer." He recognized the voice, and recognizing it realized that its quality was individual and unforgettable. To the Lady Valeria, as she stood there, it seemed that a part of the promontory's clay at her feet heaved itself up amorphously, writhed into human shape, and so resolved itself into the man she sought. She checked a startled outcry as she understood the nature of this materialization. "You will be very wet, sir, and cold." Her voice was gentle and solicitous, very different from that in which she addressed her brother's companions and the captain. Bellarion was quite frank. "As wet as a drowned man, and very nearly as cold." And he added, "I would I could be sure I shall not yet be hung up to dry." The lady laughed softly at his rueful humor. "Nay, now, we have brought the means to make you dry more comfortably, but it was very rash of you to have entered here without first making that you were not observed." "I was not observed, Madonna, else be sure I should not have entered." He caught in the gloom the sound of her breath indrawn with the hiss of sudden apprehension. "You were not observed? And yet, oh, it is just as I was fearing." And then more briskly, and before he could reply, "But come," she urged him, "we have brought fresh clothes for you. When you are dry, you shall tell me all." Readily enough, he allowed himself to be conducted within the single circular chamber of the marble pavilion, where Madonna Dionara, her lady, awaited. The place was faintly lighted by a lantern placed on a marble table. It contained, besides this, some chairs that were swathed in coarse sheets, and a long wooden coffer, carved and painted, in shape and size like a sarcophagus, from which another such sheet had just been swept. The three open spaces, between pillars facing towards the palace, were now closed by leather curtains. The circular marble floor was laid out as a dial, with the hours in Roman figures of carved brass sunk into the polished surface, a matter this which puzzled him. He was not to guess that this marble pavilion was a copy in miniature of a Roman temple of Apollo, and that in the center of the domed roof there was a circular opening for the sun, through which its rays so entered that as the day progressed, a time-telling shadow moved across the hours figured in their circle on the floor. Overhead, there was a confusion of poles and scaffolding and trailing dust sheets, and in a corner an array of pails and buckets, and all the litter of suspended painter's work. Dimly, on one of the walls, he could make out a fresco that was half painted, the other half in charcoal outline. On the table, which was swathed like all the other furnishings, the lantern revealed a bundle of red garments lately loosed from a confining cloak of black. Into these he was bidden to change at once. Red, he was told, had been deliberately chosen because all that the captain seemed to know of him was that he had been dressed in green, so that not merely would his protectress render him dry and warm again, she would disguise him. The ladies, meanwhile, would keep watch in the garden immediately below. They had brought a lute. If one of them should sing to it, this would mean that she sounded the alarm, and he must hide in the coffer, taking with him everything that might betray his presence, including the lantern which he must extinguish. Flint and steel and tinder had not been forgotten, so that light might be rekindled when the danger was overpast. Her Highness raised the lid of the coffer to reveal to him the mechanism of the snap lock. This was released, of course, by the key, which should then be withdrawn. Provided he did this, once he allowed the lid to close upon him, none would be able to open it from the outside, whilst from the inside it was an easy matter, even in the dark, to release the catch. Meanwhile, the keyhole would provide him with sufficient air, and at the same time permit him to judge by sounds of what was happening. The wet garments he removed were to be made into a bundle and dropped into the coffer, whence they would afterwards be taken and destroyed. Finally, he was given 10 minutes in which to make the change. Abruptly he found himself alone, and so impressed by her commands that already his fingers were swiftly untrussing his points. He went briskly to work, first to strip himself, then to rub himself dry and restore his chilled circulation, for which purpose he heedlessly employed the black cloak in which the fresh garments had been bundled. Then he set about donning that scarlet raiment of fine quality and modish fashion, all the while lost in wonder of her graciousness and resource. She revealed herself, he reflected, as a woman fit to lead and to command, a woman with a methodical mind and a well-ordered intelligence which many a captain of men might envy. And she revealed herself, too, as intensely womanly, an angel of compassion. Although clearly a lady of great rank, she nevertheless went to so much pains and thought to save a wretched fugitive like himself, and this without pausing to ascertain if he were worthy of compassion. As abruptly as she had left him did she now return, even as he was completing his hasty toilet, and she came alone, having left her lady with the lute on guard below. He stood now before her, a brave figure, despite his tumbled black locks and the fact that the red hose of fine cloth was a little short for his long shanks, and therefore a little cramping. But the kilted tunic became him well, with its girdle of steel and leather, which he was buckling even as she entered. She swept forward to the table and came straight to business. "And now, sir, your message?" His fingers stood arrested on the buckle, and his solemn dark eyes opened wide as they searched her pale face. "Message?" quoth he slowly. "Message, yes." Her tone betrayed the least impatience. "What has happened? What has become of Ser Giuffredo? Why has he not been near me this fortnight? What did the Lord Barbaresco bid you tell me? Come, come, sir, you need not hesitate. Surely you know that I am the Princess Valeria of Montferrat?" All that he understood of this was that he stood in a princely presence, before the august sister of the sovereign Marquis of Montferrat. Had he been reared in the world, he might have been awe-stricken by the circumstances. But he knew princes and princesses only from books written by chroniclers and historians, who treat them familiarly enough. If anything about her commanded his respect, it was her slim grace and her rather elusive beauty, a beauty that is not merely a color and of features, but of the soul and mind alive in these. His hands fell limply away from the buckle, which he had made fast at length. His lively countenance looked almost foolish, as dimly seen in the yellow light of the lantern. "Madonna, I do not understand. I am no messenger.
You are no messenger?
Her tawny head was thrust forward. Her dark eyes glowed.
Were you not sent to me? Answer, man. Were you not sent?
Not other than by an inscrutable providence, which may desire to preserve me for better things than a rope. The whimsical note of the answer may have checked her stirring anger. There was a long pause, in which she pondered him with eyes that were become unfathomable. Mechanically, she loosed the long black cloak that covered her low-cut sheathing gown of sapphire blue.
Why then did you come? Was it a spy?
No, you are not that. A spy would have gone differently to work.
What are you then?
Just a poor scholar on his travels, studying life at first hand, and a trifle more rapidly than he can digest it. As for how I came into your garden, let me tell you. And he told her with admirable succinctness the sorry tale of that day's events. It drove the last vestige of wrath from her face, and drew the ghost of a smile to the corners of a mouth that could be as tender as imperious. Observing it, he realized that whilst she had given him sanctuary under a misapprehension, yet she was not likely to visit her obvious disappointment too harshly upon him.
And I thought—
She broke off and trilled a little laugh, between mirth and bitterness.
It was a lucky chance for you, Master Fugitive.
She considered him again, and it may be that his stalwart young male beauty had a hand unconsciously in shaping her resolves concerning him.
What am I to do with you?
She asked him. He answered simply and directly, speaking not as a poor nameless scholar to a high-born princess, but as equal to equal, as a young man to a young woman.
If you are what your face tells me, Madonna, you will let me profit by an error that entails no less for yourself beyond that of these garments, which, if you wish it—
She waved the proposal aside before it was uttered.
Pooh, the garments, what are they?
She frowned thoughtfully.
But I named names to you.
Did you? I have forgotten them. And in answer to the hard incredulity of her stare, he explained himself. A good memory, Madonna, lies as much in an ability to forget as in a capacity to remember, and I have an excellent memory. By the time I shall have stepped out of this garden, I shall have no recollection that I was ever in it. Slowly she spoke after a pause.
If I were sure that I can trust you—
She left it there. Bellarion smiled. Unless you are certain that you can, you had better call the guard.
But then how could you be sure that, in that case, I should not recall the names you named, which are now forgotten?
Ah, you threaten! The sharp tone, the catch in her breath, the sudden movement of her hand to her breast, showed him that his inference was right. This lady was engaged in secret practices, and the inference itself displayed the swift activity of his wits, just as his answer displayed them.
Nay, lady, I show you only that trust me you must, since if you mistrust me, you can no more order my arrest than you can set me free.
By faith, sir, you are shrewd, for one who's convent-bred.
There's a deal of shrewdness, lady, to be learned in convents.
And then, whether the beauty and charm of her so wrought upon him as to breed in him the desire to serve her, or whether he merely offered a bargain, a return for value received and to be received, it is probable that he did not know himself. But he made his proposal.
If you would trust me, Madonna, you might even use me, and so repay yourself.
Use you?
As a messenger, in the place of him whom you expected. That is, if you have messages to send, as I think you should have.
You think it?
From what you have said.
I said so little.
She was clearly suspicious, but I inferred so much. Too much, perhaps. Let me expose my reasoning.
The truth is, he was a little vain of it. You expected a messenger from one Lord Barbaresco. You left the garden gate ajar to facilitate his entrance when he came, and you were on the watch for him, and alone. Your ladies, one of whom at least is in your confidence, were beguiling the gentlemen and keeping them in the lower garden, whilst you loitered watchful by the hedged enclosure. Hence I argue on your part anxiety and secrecy. You were anxious because no message had come for a fortnight, nor had Messer Giuffredo, the usual messenger, been seen. Almost you may have feared that some evil had befallen Messer Giuffredo, if not the Lord Barbaresco himself, which shows that the secret practices of which these messages are the subject may themselves be dangerous. Do I read the signs fluently enough? There was little need for his question. Her face supplied the answer. Too fluently, I think. Too fluently for one who is no more than you represent yourself. It is, Madonna, that you are not accustomed to the exercise of pure reason. It is rare enough. Pure reason? Her scorn, where his fatuity had expected wonder, was like a searing iron. And do you know, sir, what pure reason tells me? I can believe anything, Madonna, he said, alluding to the tone she used with him. That you were sent to set a trap for me. He perceived exactly by what steps she had come to that conclusion. He smiled reassuringly and shook his moist head. The reasoning is not pure enough. If I had been so sent, should I have been pursued and hunted? And should I not have come prepared with some trivial message to assure you that I am the messenger you are so very ready to believe me? She was convinced, but she still hesitated. But why, concluding so much and so accurately, should you offer to serve me? Say from gratitude to one who has saved perhaps my life. But I did so under a misapprehension. That should compel no gratitude. I like to think, Madonna, that you would have shown me the same charity even if there had been no misapprehension. I am the more grateful for what you have done, because I choose to believe that in any case you would have done it. Then there is this handsome suit to be paid for, and lastly and chiefly, the desire to serve a lady in need of service, which I believe is not an altogether strange desire in a man of sensibility. It has happened aforetime. That was as near as he would go to the confession that she had beglamoured him. Since it was a state of mind that did not rest upon pure reason, it is one to which he would have been reluctant to confess even to himself. She pondered him, and it seemed to him that her searching glance laid bare all that he was and all that he was likely to be. These are slight and unworldly reasons, she said at last. I am possibly an unworldly fellow. You must be indeed, to propose knight-errantry. But her need, as he had already surmised, and as he was later fully to understand, was great and urgent. It may almost have seemed to her, indeed, as if Providence had brought her this young man, not only for his own salvation, but for hers. The service may entail risk, she warned him, and a risk far greater than any you have run tonight. Risk sweetens enterprise, he answered, and wit can conquer it. Her smile broadened. Almost she laughed. You have high confidence in your wit, sir. Whereas, you would say, the experience of my last 24 hours should make me humble. Its lesson, believe me, has not been lost. I am not again to be misled by appearances. Well, here's to test you, then. And she gave him her message, which was after all a very cautious one, the betrayal of which could hardly harm her. He was to seek the Lord Barbaresco, of whom she told him nothing beyond the fact that the gentleman dwelt in a house behind the cathedral, which any townsman would point out to him. He was to inquire after his health, about which he was to add the absence of news was making her uneasy. As a credential to the Lord Barbaresco, she gave him the broken half of a gold ducat. Tomorrow evening, she concluded, you will find the garden gate ajar again at about the same hour, and I shall be waiting. Visit ClassicTalesAudiobooks.com to pick up the complete audiobook of Bellarion the Fortunate by Raphael Sabatini today.